Good afternoon, good morning, good day for you, wherever you're reaching us from. We're here today to talk with those two guys, Adam and Chris. I hope this is going to be an amazing talk. Wade was going to join us today, but unfortunately he couldn't, so we wish all the best to Wade. Really looking forward to talking with him in the next opportunity. Before we begin, just a couple housekeeping information to let you know. There's going to be people from the Birdie team helping organize you on the LinkedIn streaming. So if you want to ask something, feel free to post your questions at any time. At the end of the session, we're going to have 10 minutes dedicated to the Q&A session. So feel free to post. Don't leave this session with any doubt. We're going to do our best effort to make sure you leave this session with everything you need to use data to your best product strategies. And without further ado, let's start. For those of you who doesn't know me, I'm Pence, again here, Pence, the co-founder of Birdie. I work with the product team. And Birdie is a product analytics platform for product teams, helping to empower your product teams to make better decisions based on user feedback, the voice of the customer. We do that by creating a feedback river, a constant stream of data reaching your product teams, helping them to get information to make better decisions. By the way, we just launched a new website, so if you're curious about it, just check it out on birdie.ai. We're going to be glad if you do. Starting, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Adam, can you start? For those who doesn't know who you are.
Sure.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Thomas. I am the principal at Approaching One, where we help companies learn about product strategy and execute product strategy wherever they are.
Thank you. It's great to have you with us. And Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Chris Butler, and I'm a lead PM and the Google Core Machine Learning Group. And I mean, you said that you want people to be more certain about things after they leave here, but with the subtitle on my LinkedIn as chaotic good product manager, I don't know if I can do that with good conscience. Yeah. So I think I want to ask a lot of questions too. So let's get into it. I'm excited.
Let's see what we can do. Maybe make people leave with more questions for the next session, right? But at least with something new. Let's hope everyone leaves this with something new. Okay, now that we know our panelists, let's start. I want to start with stories. So without a lot of background, who can share something where data has helped you with a product strategy, where specific example where this was important? Want to start, Chris? And Adam, feel free to jump in if you want to complement or to share something at the end.
Sure.
Yeah, I think like the things that we've been doing a lot within the Google Core Machine Learning Group has been trying to figure out what are actually the signals that we need to have to be able to understand whether our strategy, which, if we are going to define terms, right, strategy as a decision-making model that helps everybody on the team make maybe better or easier decisions, especially in kind of hard domains. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about in particular is what are the signals from the environment that show us that the strategy that we've adopted in some way, and I can't go into like a lot of depth around that just because some of this stuff is confidential, but the concept's just around like, how do we know that in a very rapidly changing environment, especially one where, at the end of last year, ChatGPT, OpenAI's partnership with Microsoft, the implementation of conversational agents based on large language models into Bing, it's become a highly volatile space that we exist within. And, one of the things I'm trying to help us not do is be reactive, right? Because just being reactive isn't actually a strategy, right? It means that the signal that you're actually looking at, the data that you're using ends up being just your perceived opponent or competitor, which is a bad place to be, right? And if anything, I think it starts to show if we talk about like John Boyd's OODA loop, that someone else may have gotten inside your decision-making loop in some way. And so the type of like signals that we look for, though, end up being kind of like based on who our real customer is. And so within that, I would say the main customers of Google's core machine learning group tends to be internal groups that are either in research or in other major product areas, as well as cloud and then our open source kind of projects. And so from there, those customers essentially are software engineers, scientists, researchers. And so our role is to really not only provide a business capability of how do we land these types of machine learning features much faster, but how do we make it so that software engineers and researchers don't have to struggle with the tools. And so there's a little bit of kind of understanding the directionality of satisfaction, which is hard in our case, because I've definitely had lots of arguments internally with people like, should engineering be like a joyous experience? I don't think it should be in something like that. I think it should be something like where you have like flow, or you feel like you're getting things done. Like I think there's a lot of different like how we start to judge emotion in that's really interesting. But then beyond that, it's like, how do we start to look at things like hours that are spent based on a person working on an end-to-end project to be able to land some type of machine learning. So those are the things that are actually starting to modify the way we look at our strategy. Now, we're a fairly new team within Google. And then because of the fact that there are so many kind of changes in the environment right now, it gets hard to really understand how we're doing. Like I'm also part of a team that does a lot of kind of futuristic looking at like what would be the next wave of things after what we're currently building. And it's every time we come up with an idea, like someone outside in the world is like implementing it in like a GitHub repo at this point. Not exactly, but you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of like change that is happening right now. So I think that's where you need to start to look at signals that are much more, I guess, focused on what stays true, which is, or at least things that change slower. And so while there's lots of people that are getting benefits from using these type of large models in efficiency or effectiveness of their like ability to do engineering or programming, there's still a lot of people that aren't, right? And so thinking about it from that point of how do we start to make those things more valuable to them, I think is the signal we start to look at. So I don't know, those are kind of specific examples of how we started to do that. But again, it's hard for me to connect all the dots exactly for that, just because of the fact that we can't talk about all of the pieces of our strategy.
It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Adam, I think you have a lot of different scenarios, different backgrounds. So maybe you have a lot of different stories to share about it. Yeah.
And luckily I don't work for Google, so I don't have any, there's nothing to hide so much. But I thought about two stories when looking and thinking about this question. The first was when I worked for an e-com company. And the big problem that we were trying to understand is who is our ICP? Mm-hmm. And ICP, for those who don't know, is ideal customer profile. And one of the
no matter what, every time I hear that term, I still think of Insane Clown Posse for some reason. So I don't know what that says about me, but it's very hard for me to adopt that terminology. So yeah, yes. I thank you for describing it.
Sometimes it also means that, I think for both you wear makeup and very loud wigs, but either way, to make them very clear. So with ICP, we were trying to really sharpen what our ICP was. And one of the ways that I learned through this was pricing strategy within your product strategy is a great way to sharpen who that ICP was. And the data that you're going to look at when it comes to understanding your pricing is going to be your churn, specifically your churn within a short period of time, right? Who joins? And then over a short period of time, who sees value within that retention area, right? For some products that might be 2 months, for some products that might be 4 months, 6 months, it might be 2 weeks. But who stays in this space and who leaves? And that is where you start to understand your price sensitivity. And so when working there, we were trying to understand ICP. And what ended up happening was when I got there, I decided to talk to the customers that were around this space, right? And we wanted to build, and we also started building models for customers inside of that churn space. And we wanted to separate them based on their revenue, right? Their annual revenue, right? We had a lot of visibility on how big they were based on how much they were selling. And so we broke them down into quadrants and we started to look at who is the most impactful for our business long-term. Mm-hmm. And so we saw that there's this group that we call professional sellers, where they sold, 500,000 plus. And this group, when it came to churn, saw a lot of value. And in some respects, there was some slight churn. And I wanted to see what that was about. It's different than the rest. And so I went and reached out to those customers, called a few, got them on the phone, and started to understand where they were coming from. Why did they leave, or why did they stay, or what were they doing? What was around that decision point? Some people may call these switch interviews, right? If you're thinking about it from a jobs to be done point of view, right? You want to look at what the job is, right? And the job for them is, we're going to hire the software to be able to, we helped people deal with their pricing, ironically, but so we would do that. And so when talking to these customers, what I found out was pretty surprising to me, right? They thought we were too cheap, right? Some folks were nervous about if this was a scam or not, like the other cheaper products downstream, because we were still priced around them, right? And then there was this upstream competitor who was priced 10x of us, right? And people would go out to this 10x competitor because they would go, it's pricey, but this seems real for the value that they're saying, right? And so as a result, we went ahead and we increased our pricing. We doubled our pricing, and our churn numbers went down. In fact, we started to get more customers in that ICP range, primarily, and we got a chance to shift our product strategy around these professional customers. As a result of looking at this churn data and then going and doing the qualitative work of talking to these customers and understanding the job that they want us to do. And it allowed us to get more profit per customer, right, long term. And so
amazing.
that's
just to have an idea, how many people did you reach to have a consistent analysis on top of that to support this decision?
Qualitatively, I think we ended up speaking to about 25 folks within that, and then also about 5 on some of the brackets around, right? I wanted to make sure that I got a somewhat of an understanding or a picture of folks that are on the way up, what may they think, and folks that were way past that point. We called our whale customers, which had a whole other other problems that they represented, but I wanted to see what they thought. Maybe they were there at one point, and that drove that decision. And so, about in total, so that would leave about 35 folks.
One thing I'm thinking while listening to this is the different scenarios where you are in a large enterprise with a established product going on. So ongoing analysis to make optimal, small optimization of the product. And in a situation where we are defining the product, maybe finding product market fit or creating in early stages in companies. Do you see that there is a different challenges for these two kinds of folks? And what are to simplify the question, what are the main points I need to keep in mind in each of those two different kinds of organizations? Small organization to use data, what's important to have in mind? Large organization, what's important to have in mind? Does it make sense?
Yeah, and so one of the things that so I used to work for this other gentleman on the panel, and the place where we worked was a consultancy where we got a chance to interact with customers of all types of sizes. And yes, there are differences, but I think at the core of it, what's super important is, one, to understand that both quantitative and qualitative data matter. Far too often, people either over-index on one or the other, oftentimes quantitative. And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later in terms of what are some of the traps that folks get into. And I think the other thing that I think is similar is the idea that there's going to be apprehension It's one of the things that's so interesting to me, whether dealing with large enterprise, established, companies that everyone knows, and companies where, no one knows, right? Is there's a fear around connecting the people which they're working with, and the data itself, and doing that, the rigorous process of understanding that, hey, we might be wrong. And so no matter where you are, it's going to be a challenge to step into data and step into data authentically, which means going into it with the idea of it might lead us into being wrong, a falsifiable hypothesis, and covering our bases, whether it's quantifiable or qualifiable.
Yeah, that's great. Chris, anything to add here?
Well, I mean, I think that the product manager motto should really be, we are wrong today, we just don't know how. And, the idea of being curious and really being less certain about what we think we understand is really, I think, an important stance for this. And I would just absolutely agree and echo what Adam is saying about this balance between qualitative and quantitative. I think that what you'll find is that in earlier stage companies, there's less ability to find quantitative information that's not used by everybody else. And what that means is that that's not maybe helpful information for you to differentiate on. And so qualitative information, though, in that particular case, going out and talking to people, and I don't mean surveys, right? Because I think there's that's a weird Frankenstein's monster.
Surveys are very much the double diamond of data analysis. Do not attempt them unless you are an expert, or else
that's right.
Trouble.
Oh.
Absolutely. And I work with someone who is very, very good at this type of surveying. I think that for product managers that don't work with user experience professionals or sociologists or whatever, they end up missing the rigor that's required for surveys to actually be valuable in some way. And so it ends up being oh, well, I need to go and talk to a bunch of people. Why don't I just send out a survey to a bunch of people? And I think that's the wrong way to go, right? You should be going there as a product manager. Part of it is your embodied experience of understanding how your customers think and talk and do things, right? There is a transition point that you start to then be able to collect, say, behavioral information, right? And I think there's a really interesting point that some of the most important behavioral information is the information that only you can collect, right? And so actually the harder pieces of information that you can start to get to, at first you'll have to use proxies, of course, because you won't have the depth of that. But the closer you can get to measuring really, really hard things, the more differentiated your product will end up being. But I would say inside of large organizations too, they all do I think they do a poor job unless you're working with a really good kind of data scientist. I think this discernment between what is a leading and a following metric is something that people don't end up doing, right? They end up just looking at following metrics and trying to game those in some way rather than trying to find, in the terminology of Amazon, it would be input versus output metrics. And so I think there's something very interesting there too, that when we start thinking about what is valuable at a larger stage organization is that you should have access to more customers. So that means your behavioral data should be better in some way, right? You'll have access to more different types of quantitative information, and you want to take advantage of that. But you should never lose sight of the fact that you should still be talking to customers and you should still be listening to them. And ideally you're doing that as a cross-functional team rather than just say researchers, right? Now, you can actually, if you trust your researchers, you can still learn an awful lot from them. But I think Jared Spool still believes, or his saying is that I think it's 2 hours every 6 weeks is the minimum requirement, he says, for everybody on the team that makes product decisions should listen to their customers for 2 hours every 6 weeks. And I think that's probably a good kind of way to think about it. If you're not reviewing this stuff, or even if it's ad hoc talking to them, as long as you can learn how to speak in clean language, you're not talking about what would you do. There's a bunch of basics that if you can just do that when you're having a one-on-one conversation with your customer, I think you get way further just as a product manager, especially, but also as a team trying to make better decisions about how to help customers in some way.
I want to add in, this includes engineers, everyone. Very much includes engineers.
Totally. Yeah, and actually also includes leaders, right? I think this is another thing that I've been starting to realize is, or maybe not realize, but I've seen this in previous times when, especially when Adam and I work together, there would be a difference between the people that would participate in all the workshops and then the leaders that would kind of like go off and do something else while we were all working. The reality is like, we need them to provide their context, and we need them to understand the context. And so I think, just like a great writing culture inside of an organization requires a good manager reading culture, I think this idea of like, how do you actually balance good qualitative versus quantitative information means that leaders also need to be adept at reading and understanding those things and taking the time to do that, right? Like if they honestly believe that that is the best thing for us to do, is to spend time doing these types of like metric reviews, for example, they should be there, right? And they should be asking lots of questions. And so I think that's another aspect that ends up when we talk about like the cultural change that's required for being more data oriented or more research oriented or whatever. It actually comes through with the leaders that are on that team putting in the time to show that it's valuable in some way.
Oh, this is amazing. So to try to simplify that, it means there is no right time to start using data. The right time is right now. No matter if you're a smaller organization and you don't have enough quantitative data to rely on, connect.
Well, I'd say it's like planting a tree. Like the right time was like 10 years ago. The first best time is 10 years ago. The second best time is today. And so that's what I would say. It's very similar to.
For those of the folks who are listening to us, start today. Do your best with what you have. If you have a couple clients you can connect with, start listening to them. If you have a large database, you can start segmenting and going deep. But don't forget the users. Even if you're large and established, don't forget the people who are using your product. This is good. This is strong.
And so I also want to add in, there is value, even if you don't have a ton of data, right? You don't have to be Google or Meta or with stores and reams of data. Sometimes simple things, even things in which you can count amongst your user base, right, can provide the aspect of, it can give you guidance as to where you want to go next, right? One book that I love to not as much read because it can be difficult at times, but one I love to recommend is Douglas Hubbard's How to Measure Anything, right? And if you want a quick introduction or reintroduction to statistics, it is a great book to pick up. And one of the points that he makes, and one of the things I'm seeing more and more as I talk to customers and help them understand strategy and data, is that even a small amount of data can give you, it can help, it's a rung on the ladder for you to be data informed or data literate. Like just, what can we see, right? Sometimes it's just, what can we see? And we can move on from there. So even if you don't have these complicated systems, you don't have, data science teams or any of that, start with what you can see.
Well, and even maybe making it so that even the idea of like counting stories that you've heard of this type, right, is something that may not be something that you're going to automatically collect and you'll have to hand load into a dashboard. But if like you just look at like what is coming, like when you end up like talking to people, I've heard like X number of these stories, and X number of these stories say to us that we're doing maybe the right thing, that we want to start tracking the number of those and what can we do to now make more of those stories happen, right? Like when we talk about especially the idea of kind of complexity and the complexness of the way that our customers are not only interacting with us, but with also kind of all of the different people and systems that they end up working through, looking for patterns inside those systems end up just being stories. And so that's why like, the idea of like qualitative information is really just stories kind of modified, like taken in a very particular way. But you can start to now look at these in a sense of like, how are we seeing an increase in the types of stories that we're hearing from customers? And I think that's a great starting point, even if you're not going to have like a fully automated pipeline, to Adam's point about like these huge like systems that are dealing with all the data all the time. I totally agree with that. And I would second that book is one of my, I'd say top 10 best product management books in my opinion.
Okay, good. Well, here I already have a recommendation. Can you get the book name again? What's the book?
How to Measure Anything.
How to Measure Anything. Great.
Yeah, and maybe the other part that's interesting about that book, at least a really big lesson I took away from it too, is that as product managers, we need to make decisions with limited information. And by the time that you have perfect information, the value of that information is probably much less. And so I think there's kind of this like point where you need to say, I'm willing to move forward with this decision. And again, when we talk about decision making, everybody likes to refer to the idea of like type 1 and type 2 decisions, like reversible and irreversible. I have to tell you, based on the arrow of time, there is no such thing as a reversible decision, unfortunately. But in reality, like if you make lots of small decisions, right, the idea of those very like super rare irreversible decisions, which end up being like humongous brand launches or signing a contract or something very specific, it's like punctuated like that, almost everything becomes a small decision. And so that's why like making small decisions based on very limited information, I think is like a key thing for product managers to do. And that's why like being able to be resilient, robust, and actually thrive in that type of uncertainty requires you to make decisions in a way that also is maximizing learning. And so I think that's another thing that I kind of took away from that book that I think is really powerful. It's just that as you get closer to the decision point, the information becomes less and less valuable because it's known, right? There's no like arbitrage that you can do to make a better decision based on limited information then.
This pretty much already puts us in the next topic I would bring about is how does data change the way we approach product management? I think we covered some of it here. I want to see if you guys would add something that data has changed on the day-to-day activity of product managers and add a new question at the end. What's about to change with generative AI and all this stuff? How is this about to change the way we work with data and information decision making? So past and future, if you may add on.
I think one thing I want to punctuate is that data allows us to be falsifiable. And again, that's not 100% either, but when it's working, it gives us a point to say, okay, we're wrong. And so let's change direction. Quite easy to fall under what I call the trap of go, which is we're just going to keep building and keep building and keep building and keep building and keep building. And when I say building, I really mean reacting to the world around us instead of thinking about how we want to proceed in the world. And so data allows us to have an anchor on our decisions. Now, we can talk about how that anchor can get really rusty or the anchor could be a false anchor, but in general, right, it's important that that anchor is there.
And I think maybe one thing I'd add about maybe the future of this type of data is I am very concerned about people using things like GPT or ChatGPT or Bard or whatever you end up using, right, to use like generative text output systems. I'm seeing some kind of like pop-ups of like, hey, you don't need to talk to any users, just talk to ChatGPT about the questions you have. And I want to warn people about that. Now, I think when we talk about heuristic, right, like maybe the idea of say heuristic-based usability, right, I think is something that we might be able to use these types of systems to build, because it's, if we think about at least the way that these models are built today, is it's a certain point in time that actually this model has collected a bunch of data and then turned it into basically a model, right? The problem will be is that is the average, basically, of what the internet is thinking at a certain point. And so I think that will not help you build differentiated features, right? It will not give you data that is differentiated or specific or nuanced or segmented or all those things. It will give you kind of like general answers. And I would say that for people that are experts in a particular field, when they look at the answers there, they do feel like it's very bland or kind of not cutting edge or not, really going after what is really valuable potentially and is very middling. And so I think that's one thing I would just warn against, is that there is a possibility that these systems can start to include more active data. And then we start to get into some interesting places where like the translation from anything to anything characteristics of these models mean that maybe people don't have to think about like SQL to be able to go and query a database as much, right? They still need to worry about the intricacies of some of that stuff. And that is something that I think we're going to learn about more as time goes on, is like, where are the errors that will start to pop up because someone uses natural language to query a data set and then gets out a report, and then where did that thing actually hallucinate, right? And where did it make up things, and how did it maybe mistake your ambiguity? Because human language is incredibly ambiguous, right? Like I think one of the most interesting or important things about this is that by us working in teams, we start to resolve certain types of ambiguity, but we also allow for other ambiguities to exist to allow for like variances of ideas that we end up considering. So I think there's some like there's some really interesting stuff that's going to happen, but it's going to be very fraught with like lots of errors. And so that's the part that we don't know yet, is where will those errors come out. And so I don't know. It's just like a warning that I would give everybody about some of these things that I see there. But definitely don't talk to GPT instead of a customer. Just talk to your customer. I understand why that's a big deal.
Yeah, talk to them. I'll also add the right. I think these issues fall under the things that data falls, like the problems that data has now, which is data governance and data integrity. Like, if you're not sure, by governance, I mean who uses the data, how is it represented, where can it go? And by integrity, I mean how real is it? And so one of the problems with these generative models is they don't think about these things, right? They don't have the ability to think about these things. They just take data
and they don't think.
Yes.
They don't think.
Yeah. You know what? Very true, right? Very clear.
We use a lot. This terminology is really hard. Yeah.
Let me be really clear. It doesn't think at all, right? And so it just promotes these guesses based on the percentage of confidence it has in the next thing. And so sometimes that means that you're going to hallucinate data, right? And that's a data integrity problem. Do that over time, right? You may get away with it once. Your ability to be trusted as a source of data dissipates. And the minute an expert sees that, well, you're out of the game, right? The other thing is, back to what Chris was saying about heuristics, one thing to worry about there is that we're in the business of making things novel and interesting. And you start, it can turn into what lawyers call papering, right? Which is a whole bunch of data that really, like, I guess it's true, but doesn't really help me make decisions, right? And the thing that I think data is really good at when it's used and leveraged well is to help people make decisions, not just you, but the people around you. And so if you're papering people with a bunch of, just standard, oh, the sky is blue, leaves are green, dirt's brown. It's like, all right, oh, I already know all this stuff, right? Like the salesperson will go, I talked to, okay, I already know all this. The customer success person will go, I retain customers, I talk to them. What do they do over there again? They just tell me that the sky is blue and the grass is green. I like, where are my features? Get them on safe. I need to get people on safe because then I know stuff is going to happen. So just want to punctuate that AI doesn't change things.
I'm not going to say anything about safe right now, but I do want to like double down on the point you made about like, I also think about it as like surprise, right? Like really interesting information is actually surprising in some way. And I think like we do fall into this trap, I think, where, what is not surprising or what doesn't change our decision-making capability in some way. Like every time I see a dashboard, I will, like, one of my first questions I ask people is like, what happens if this piece of information goes up or down? What do you do differently? And if it doesn't have an impact, like it doesn't change what you do, and you just kind of like, oh, it just went up or down today. Like if that doesn't cause you to actually start to do something differently, then I would argue that it's more of like an emotional need, which there are emotional needs for data, right? Like leaders, executives need to see lots of dashboards as like I wrote a post that was called "Dashboards Are Cowardly," which was really just about this idea of, people that want to see lots of dashboards and want to just be able to play with the data, they may actually have some like valuable reason to do that. But more often than not, I've seen that managers and executives don't actually make different decisions unless there's like very significant changes inside of dashboards. And so they use it as something that I think what they're trying to get at is like, do they feel like they know what's going on in the business, one? And then two, do they start to feel a tempo of the business, which is also valuable? But I think you can build those types of things through better like organization within your team. The idea of tempo is one that I think is really interesting too, is just like, how do you get a feeling for how the business is chugging along cyclically over time? I think is a very interesting thing, but it's not just like a million dashboards that they can look through. It's probably a very short number of them, right? Like it's probably like, again, KPIs, key performance indicators, that means like a small number. That doesn't mean every performance indicator. Right. And so I think that's really, really important.
Indicator, not indicators.
Yeah.
Well, and that's maybe the problem too, is we've gotten into this like language trap where, priority used to just mean one thing as well. Yeah. Right. And so now we're in this realm of like, I just saw a post today, which I don't remember who the author was. So I can't even like make fun of them right now if I wanted to, and I wouldn't, but like it said, how do you prioritize your OKRs? And I was like, inside of what the OKR framework is supposed to do is not have prioritization. It's supposed to be, it's prioritized, right? Like these things that you're working on, and this is something that Google suffers from, by the way, is like, I don't want to like dash everybody's dreams about Google being perfect at OKRs. I don't think we are in a lot of ways, and I've written a lot of posts about it. But once I start seeing things where it's like, this is a P0 OKR versus a P2 OKR, I think you've lost the script as far as like what OKRs are supposed to be doing. So just adding on top of what you're talking about.
And just really quickly, Christina Watkey, who I think wrote the best book on OKRs, Radical Focus, she recently had an interview with Melissa Perry where she talked about how she's reconstructed OKRs through her work, even past the second edition of the book. And one thing she has seen over and over again, and the problem with teams is primarily around too many OKRs, right? Back to Chris's point around prioritization, right? If she said, look, a team probably should have one OKR, maybe two. And you have to think about each OKR, each objective and key result. And for those who don't know what OKR is, objective and key result, right? Each objective and each key result is something else somebody has to hold in their brain. And generally, this is across multiple teams that have their own things going on. And so if you have this huge Excel spreadsheet with 52 objectives, P0s, P1s, P2s, right? Everybody's going to forget it because they have to, or else they're not going to be able to do their job. So, and that's why you start seeing the numbers start magically going up. They're at 5% 3 weeks out before the quarter, and then magically they get to 87% before we do. Every time it's magic, right? But it's really primarily because folks, can't. They don't have the focus, and so OKRs need to be leveraged judiciously, and we can't overload the people that use them.
Yeah. We talked about the importance of data helping other people around you. We talk about getting clear, expectations and clear some of the impact of that data being changed. So you need to understand what impact that data will generate. Can you guys think of practical tips for people to effectively communicate their strategy based on the data they're looking at? Making this data make sense for more people. How should I do that more effectively? Adam, you're nodding, so.
Yeah, no, first, I think sometimes this stuff is far simpler than people make it. Like literally bring somebody in a room and say, what does this number mean to you? You would be surprised at the answers you may get back. And then, okay, then this isn't, okay, this isn't what I did. It's not what I intended. Okay, let me try another number, right? And I try another number, right? If you tie, whatever number is important to whoever that person in the room is, right? If there's something that they can understand, and then Chris mentioned earlier about story, right? How numbers become stories. If you create and talk about what the stakes are with this number, why is this number important, and where are we ultimately trying to go? If you tie that to an incentive and a proxy that other person understands, now all of a sudden it's a lot easier to understand what you're trying to do. And so, yeah, the number one tip is and I told this to some of my coaching clients who, tend to be around product leaders who are starting to do this on a larger scale. It's like, did you bring the CFO in and ask them, what do they think of this number? Why is it important? And did you tell them stakes around this number? And ultimately I get a no. And then next week they come back and they go, oh, we had such a great conversation. They didn't know any of that. Sometimes it's just as simple as just showing them and asking them what the number is.
Yeah, that's great. I think I like to tie very, decision-making or decision-making models in strategy, especially as like a high abstraction level type of thing. I think of my go-to a lot of the time is what are called even over statements. And so I just wrote a post maybe a month or so ago with this it's a project called the uncertaintyproject.org, where we talk about decision-making models and frameworks and stuff like that. But I wrote a post about even overs and the way that I end up using them in strategic discussions. And the even over is like this over that. So like in the Agile Manifesto, it's like people over processes. And it doesn't mean we never use processes. It just means if we're given a choice between people and processes, we'll choose people usually. And so I think like setting up a strategy that has a couple of these things kind of interlocking together, and they're not messy, they're not going to be perfectly aligned all the time. You will find nuance at kind of the lowest levels of abstractions that kind of interfere with each other, or maybe we may have to then like actually stack rank our even overs over which of those things end up trading off. What I think is important as part of those is that one, stories of the times that we've actually made decisions like this, right? It's not just aspirational, but it's actually the way we do this decision making here. And then the signals I was talking about really at the beginning of this discussion is that how do we know that this decision-making model or this trade-off is actually helping us in some way, right? And so I think linking each of these things to not only stories, but metrics in some way, I think is really powerful. And so I would not say that we do it perfectly today in any way. So it's still kind of, for me, it's aspirational, but I think the discussions that we've had once we start talking about the trade-offs and we talk about what are the signals for those trade-offs, we end up getting much further. And maybe that's like the pattern that you should see between both Adam and mine, like kind of response to this is that it's more about these alignment discussions that are taking place where there's a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion that's taking place about what is actually going on. Now, I want to also temper this that I think I've been kind of like obsessed with this one paper that's all about strategic ambiguity right now, and I'm writing another post about that. So there's still something valuable about that. You want everybody to kind of mostly align, but you want to allow for people to like misalign a tiny bit. And so I think that's why also strategies end up being very, very rough cut or very like high abstraction, because you want that cone of possibility to still be fairly wide for people to be able to find stuff inside there. And then if you find like the nuance of the stories that are coming from like the low abstraction work, which is like, I built something and I shipped it to a customer and this is what they said, right? That should also feed upwards in the sense of like, how, like, are we seeing patterns that are starting to come out that the signals are saying that we're wrong in this trade-off in some way, or that it's not as helpful as it could be. So that's how I kind of connect those things is through that.
So quick ad break for survival metrics, which helps teams do this exact work, which is my thing. But I think I want to punctuate that the idea of strategic incongruence and this over that, I think ultimately work together when done correctly, because you want to have people, you want people to have some sort of tether. Right? And that layer of abstraction is super helpful to get people to have that anchor that they can hold on to. But you want to make sure that they have space to discuss the differences that they're seeing out into the world. And so when I was, last place I was a product leader, Smart Recruiters, using this over that within product strategy was extremely helpful for folks, not just in the R&D area, which I worked, but also talking to folks in the sales organization or the customer success organization, because the words that you use, and these are going to be words that are just understandable to everybody, like speed or infrastructure or, things that people can understand, should create questions, right? And these questions, back to these alignment conversations, these are going to be the things that help people make decisions based on your strategy. Because if people are not making decisions based on your strategy, it is dead, right? Mm-hmm. People have to use the thing. And if they don't understand the thing, much like OKRs we talked about earlier, they'll dismiss the thing because they have other things to do. They have stuff to react to. They have bosses, right? They have these ideas of what's going to get them fired. And so if you have a strategy that doesn't talk to any of these things or doesn't help them move forward in any proactive way, well, of course they're going to ignore it, because that's what they need to do in order to keep their jobs. And so extremely important that you give people some anchor to hold on to. And then, as Chris mentioned, this ability to argue about it.
Yeah. And I mean, I've used another kind of technique that we've stolen from wargaming. I'm starting to call strategic rehearsals, but it's really this idea that we build a map of what we're doing, and then we have events that take us into the future. And one of the things that we just recently did during like a product team summit, which was like everybody on the product team gets together, and I had everybody kind of in smaller teams do this strategic rehearsal, we found that we were being very reactive because we did not have as much alignment around the strategy that we had built internally. And so I think that was like a really important moment for everybody to realize was that, we don't have the strategy as internalized as we'd like it to be. And it's not actually helping us make hard decisions as much as it should be. And so I think that's like a very important thing. So anyways, you can find it on the Uncertainty Project as well, just like a short overview of that. But I think there's something interesting about how do we kind of understand that? And same thing for like scenario planning, if you're like looking to the future of like, what are the uncertainties we have about this? And what are the 4 different worlds that come out of 2 different uncertainties? You start to then be able to ask questions about like, what is our strategy? Like, not only how does our strategy fare potentially in this, but I think like, what are the early signals that one of these worlds are coming to be? Right. And that's another amazing, important thing that when we're talking about like the strategic kind of looping that is happening, because once you get to that higher abstraction level as well, your ability to get information or feedback from the world becomes much longer for time frame. Because if you're just like releasing things where you're like, did I make this click through go up or something like that? Like that's very, very low abstraction type of work, which is valuable, but it's not as connected to like, is our strategy working? Right. Which may take months to understand whether a certain steering maneuver actually helped or not. So I think there's some interesting things there about like, how do you look to the future to also try to understand what are signals we should be aware of in some way. We'll always be surprised by something, right? Again, like we are wrong today, we just don't know how. It's just that we need to in some way like start to build up our muscle on like, how do we start to look at what are the types of changes happening in the environment that are most important?
I remember one conversation having with a couple of friends in product management, different stages in the companies. One of them said, I have something like 30 million points of feedback from clients, writing reviews in the App Store. I don't even know where to start from. And the other said, and my question is about when it's time to stop. How do I know it's already too much data and I'm going to an infinite loop and it's time to start doing something with this? So how to know where to start from and when it's time to stop looking, stop digging?
It depends.
It depends.
It had to happen eventually. It had to happen eventually.
It always happens. It's the perfect question for it. But I think some things to think about when looking at a wide swath of data. One is first understanding you're never going to read it all. And just acknowledging that, right? The reason why you're capturing this is not for you to sit back and read it like it's the Matrix coming down from the screen and you're just absorbing all of it like Neo. Like that's not how this works, right? The idea is to be able to sample and understand kind of what trends are you seeing. And so I think it's important to take a look and understand what your strategy is. And this is why strategy is extremely important before looking at data, because you need to understand what direction you're going, because people are going to talk about everything, right? God forbid this is some sort of NPS survey that they're looking at, where it's going to be a mixed match of all types of data. But regardless of what type of survey or whatever it is, whatever the input's coming in, you're trying to look for a sample, right? So pick a few random, right? This is where randomization comes into play, right? And if you start seeing a bunch of things saying about the same thing, okay, now this is something that we should be doing something about. Or if it's against something that your company is lock, stock, and barrel against, right? These are company red lines, right? These are things that, maybe there's a legal issue, a regulatory issue, a compliance issue, right? These are things that you should stop everything and start moving towards in terms of fixing. However, for the most part, these things are, when they happen, they're great because they lead us to somewhere. And again, looking at samples, you don't need to look at a ton, right? You don't need to sit there and look at, 2 million pieces of data of the 30 million, right? A pattern should emerge rather quickly if you look at 50, 100 of them. And then you act on it, right? You should time box your decision. I mean, this is where sprints come into play, or like the idea is to time box, right, the decisions that we're making. And so whenever you pick an issue, right, you got this amount of time of discovery, this amount of time of delivery, and off you go. The idea is to make sure that as Chris mentioned earlier, that it's a small decision, right? And you stack these small decisions up to ladder into something bigger and more important or greater, i.e. your strategy. Or if it's a compliance or something that's critical, then we know that we need to stop, make sure this is fixed and move on until it's fixed, right? That's where a team may slide into project mode, which is a whole other way of thinking, because this is something that has to be done, right? We got to take our product hats off a bit, right? Our complexity hats off, which is the hat that we've been using and thinking about this entire conversation. Product managers, when in product mode, work in complexity land, right? Which is ambiguity. We don't know where we end. We build off problems, and then you go into project mode, right? Which is complicated work. We know where our endpoint is. We know what our problem is. The idea is just to get to that, right? And everything should be focused on doing that. Now, the problem with teams is they tend to mix the two. And so they try to do some project stuff while they're in product, or they try to do some product stuff while they're in project, and the two are incongruent, right? It ends up slowing us down. PMP and Gantt charts are great for projects, terrible for product. The other thing is they don't declare the difference to people outside of the work that they do that are impacted by the work that they do. So this is another thing I coach product leaders on about, which is when you're doing project work, you should tell people around you that project work is happening, right? We got these timelines. We're going to change how we communicate with you. It's going to be based on this Gantt chart, but this is not how we generally operate. This is a separate mode of operation. The general mode of how we operate is product. And we only release project mode when it is something that has to be done. So let's be very clear, all right? This is the work that has to be done, and in some respects, even get sign off from people from up on the ladder to say this change is happening. Put some ceremony around that change. And then, go about it. I feel like this is a bit of a departure. It's something I think about a lot because it's affected me as a product leader more than I think folks talk about in general. But look at the sampling, pull the information, and then jump into it.
Yeah, and maybe this is related to, I like that idea of kind of being more deliberate about the domain that we're in, right? I think is really helpful. And I don't know, I do wonder whether all of the data that we collect, right? Like when we have like a data lake or lake house or swamp or bayou or whatever we end up having as far as like collections of data, it was collected with a certain thing in mind. And it was collected with a certain question in mind, which may not be appropriate for the information that we need now. And so I think unless there's like really overwhelming evidence of something that's coming out of those, that's emergent out of those types of data sets, and that's interesting where I think like generative models may be able to help summarize and do some better job of like understanding and tagging and all that type of thing. Like I think there's a possibility for that. I wonder though, like that to me, like part of my job actually is, so I PM the PM experience inside my group, which is really about like product manager effectiveness a lot of the time. And anytime that someone asks me for a very massive change across the entire organization, my initial inclination is just to say no. And the reason why is like, unless there's like real value that we see as being left on the table based on the fact we don't have this process, for example, I would much rather that I go and we try something like experiment and then see the information that comes out of that experiment to then decide if we move forward, rather than this idea of like, someone just has a whim where they're like, we need to do this thing. And I'm like, well, one, where's the evidence for this, right? If we have like just massive evidence that says we need to go off and do this thing, then that makes a lot of sense to me. But I think we need to go back to this idea that like, the reason why we do small experimentation is because the data that comes out of it is highly, highly contextual, right? And if we don't have that highly contextual data, we may make a wrong decision in some way. So I think that's another like really important aspect of this discernment between vast amounts of data that we're like looking for patterns in versus the idea of like, we have an idea and we want to test it out. Those are very kind of different modes as well, I think. And I think people get caught up too much trying to like read the tea leaves of the large information to do the big bang things, rather than this idea of like, the small experiment is actually super cheap and allows us to learn way more about that particular thing. So that's what I would say.
Makes a lot of sense, gentlemen. We're getting to the end of this. We're 5 minutes from closing the session today. I'm going to ask you both 1 minute to bring the Q&A to see what the people in the LinkedIn streaming, they shoot to us. And I can't say if it's good or bad, but it looks like we only got one question. I hope that this is because everything is so clear and people got so much good information for them.
Well, maybe I'm not like saying enough spicy stuff. Right? Yeah, I need to disagree with the world of product management, I guess, a bit more so that I can get my TikTok, numbers up.
But I hate product management. No, product management sucks.
Well, here's an oldie but goodie for me is product managers should not make technical decisions or usually be technical. How about that? That riles them up a lot. So
yeah.
Oh, that's the one bridge we both crossed together.
One question we got, and unfortunately I don't have the name of the person who shoot the question here, but he or she goes like, how often should a product leader reassess their product strategy? Do consumer insights drive it somehow? Chris, wanna go?
Sure. I mean, I think I've been loving this terminology of like Chronos versus Kairos as a way to think about time. And so Chronos is like, every month or every quarter or something like that. And a lot of people usually plan on a yearly basis, honestly, when it comes to strategy. I think they should be doing updates or like looking at the signals that we've been talking about and adjusting the even overstatements on a monthly or quarterly basis. I think for like a larger team, I think you don't want to do it much more rapidly than that. Like if you're doing like massive change in what you're working on every week, you're probably like in a prototyping phase, which means you're just learning, right? And so you probably shouldn't have a very definitive strategy at that point anyways. The Kairos time, though, is about this idea that like there's a big change in the environment or the world in the way that you perceive things. And so for us, like, when ChatGPT was launched and then it sparked the imagination of everybody online, that was a Kairos moment for us to reconsider when COVID shut down a lot of businesses and changed the way that like I was working for Facebook Rowdy Labs on the Portal device at the time, which was, moving everybody to like video calling because people didn't want to be in the same room with each other. So those were like moments where we had to reassess our strategy, our OKRs, everything. So I think like we should be aware of both of those things. And we should allow for the Kairos version of this adjustment because I think too often we have everybody at the lower abstraction levels within the organization that are working on teams that are trying to figure out what to do in response to those things. But then the higher abstraction level is just like, we're just going to keep moving forward with the strategy we have because we believe that it's still valuable. But we haven't questioned the assumptions that were underpinning that strategy that may have changed now that like a huge event has happened either in our industry or the world or whatever, right? So I think that's kind of the way I think about the cadence is it should be both on a regular basis, but then we should be very aware of like massive changes in the landscape that we need to now adjust to. And that landscape is specific to your organization, right? It's not just the world stage, but like your organization, like new regulation, right? Could be coming in certain geographic areas that you're widely distributed, could be another huge thing that you need to take care of in some way.
So this is great because this is my spicy hot take. If you are looking at your strategy at the same time every year, you don't have a strategy because nothing is affected. There's no change there. Nothing moved you throughout the year. You spent all this time thinking about what's important to you, what changes are going to happen. And you guys went into a room and you had a crystal ball and you saw everything. And you ferment it and you're going to go into the room and see that crystal ball ever again. But the truth is there's no crystal ball, right? And another truth is we're working in these complex environments. Part of the joy of product is the fact that we don't know where things are going to be done. There is no done, right? And because of that, we work in this world of ambiguity. And so with that level of ambiguity comes, you're looking for signals, signs that I think goes towards that Kairos idea. And your strategy should contain these ideas, these bets that help us understand when we should change and when we shouldn't. And none of that has anything to do with time. And so if you are clear about the strategy you're working with and you're addressing and using the strategy that you're working with, you should have some information about whenever these trimmers are happening, you should be able to go back and take a look, right? It shouldn't be so far-fetched that, you know, what teams end up doing is they end up creating this crystal ball thing, and then they put it in a drawer and it goes away until that next year they go, all right, what did we do? How did we do? Oh,
let's do it again. Yeah.
And Google Docs, by the way, does have a way for you to look at activity on your document, and you should be doing that for every document that you use, because of the fact, like, if you see that no one's referencing this, that means your document is no longer valuable in some way, and that includes strategy documents. So
very much. I've been using that lately, and I've been putting that in my presentations about strategy. It's like, yeah, this is your strategy graveyard, and it's just a picture of that with nothing on it, right? This means nobody's using it, right? And if you're doing it year by year, I can almost guarantee with certainty that nobody is reading it, because you're telling people what to do, and it's a to-do list, not a strategy. And so the answer to that question is start putting some bets in the strategy. Start to acknowledge the strategy on a regular basis. One thing that dear Chris here had us do when I was working for him at the consultancy was this concept called a proto strategy, which you would write out, you would write out these 5 pages and 3 pages, and then we come into a room and Chris would be like, hey, tell your proto strategy, right? And we would work it down, right? What are your assumptions? What's going on? What's the data that you're pulling? What's the environment like, right? These questions would come up, and this would be something that you could look at, right? And look at it with reality. And you would see where your trimmer points are, right? Again, survival metrics, love it. But yeah, that's it, right? Like, you don't have a strategy if you're looking at it once a year.
Nope, makes a lot of sense. Make it so you can check and adapt shorter cycles. If you're doing it once a year, it means you're just writing a document. Yeah. Gentlemen, we even are 2 minutes over time here. I wanna again thank you for your time, or all the sharing, all the knowledge shared here. I certainly enjoy a lot of the time. We have another question, but I'll make sure we can get the answer for that asynchronously and get back to Wendell, who is asking about the role of product designers in strategy. I think we can get something insightful for him. So I'll make sure we get to you and get back to him. Again, thank you and enjoy the day. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having us. It's been a great discussion. Thank you.
It's been tremendous. Thank you.